Hello, everyone, and welcome to P&P Live. This is a brand new kind of venture for us, but we're really excited about it, and we're excited to be able to bring you author events like we always have through Politics and Prose, but just in a new format. We are working through some technical difficulties, but we'll power through. So if for whatever reason your screen freezes, sometimes it helps just to restart. And if the author for some reason goes off screen, we will be working behind the scenes to get that up. So just stay patient with us. A couple of things before we start. I'm so excited for all of you to be here. We just really appreciate you guys in this time. Things are changing by the day, and we think here at Politics and Prose that books really foster a sense of community that all of us really need right now. And we just thank you so much for being here and for supporting us in this time. It means a lot to us. At any time during the event, you can click on the green button down at the bottom of your screen. It's the link for Eduardo Porter's book, and it goes directly to the Politics and Prose website. We are offering free shipping through March 31st. So you will get your book at no shipping cost. And again, book sales are the way that we can keep putting these events on day after day. We have a packed schedule already setting up for April. So please, please, please support us and buy the authors' books, because it's really tough for authors right now to have books out during this pandemic. They worked so hard and for so long. And so we really want to be able to support them as well. Just like at all of our in-person events, you can ask the author a question. It looks like some of you have actually already submitted questions, which is great. Feel free to vote on the questions that you see so that Eduardo will actually answer them in the order that they get the most votes. And then, of course, feel free to ask questions throughout the event, and he will answer those for you. Unlike in-person events, the author, me, no one else on screen can see you, so get comfy, grab a cup of tea, settle in. Nobody can see or judge what you're wearing, so rest assured that only Eduardo will be on screen. Eduardo Porter is an economics reporter for the New York Times, and he brings us his new book, American Poison: How Racial Hostility Destroyed Our Promise. At its core, the book is a smart and incisive exploration of how racism in this country has undermined all of our institutions and social programs. In it, Porter points the way toward hope, illuminating the ways in which, as the nation becomes increasingly diverse, it is possible to construct a new understanding of racial identity and a more cohesive society on top of it. So, without further ado, it is my pleasure to bring Eduardo Porter up onto your screen.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Just so you know, I didn't hear any of that you just heard because, technology. And so I hope you come away from that presentation with a good impression of me. I promise I'm not in my PJs. Thank you so much for sparing this bit of your lockdown time to listen to me talk a little bit about American Poison. I truly appreciate it. And I've got to admit that I'm a little bit at a loss about, given the circumstances, how to talk to you about this book that I've just written. And sitting here in my kitchen, I thought that maybe the best way to start, given the world that we are now living in, would be to tell you a little bit about how I came to write about this subject, to write this book. And because I didn't set out to write a book about race. What started me down this path to American Poison, it was something entirely different. It was America's dead babies. I was trying to get my head around why so many babies in this country, just under 7 out of every 1,000 births, die before they turn 1. So I looked into the literature. I read about kind of like the enormous progress that we made since the death of Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, the son of Jackie and JFK in 1963, the year I was born, just 39 hours after he was born. So since then, we've put an enormous amount of effort into researching the causes. We figured out that the lungs of premature babies lack a substance that's needed to prevent the air sacs from collapsing between breaths. And we've learned how to make this substance, called a surfactant, from the lungs of cows and pigs. We've developed technologies to feed babies medicine through the umbilical vein and to measure the oxygen levels in their blood through the umbilical artery. And a lot of these discoveries have been funded by American taxpayers. Today, almost all babies born, like Patrick, after 32 weeks gestation, survive. The progress has been astounding. And still, what brought me to this moment was the fact that for all these achievements, the infant mortality rate in the United States is still off the charts. It is about double what it is in South Korea, about 3 times what it is in Japan, more than 6 times what it is in Iceland. In the OECD, the club of industrialized countries, only Chile, Mexico, and Turkey have higher rates of infant mortality than the United States. We are roughly on par with Croatia. Now, the proximate cause of this is, of course, poverty. You won't be surprised to know that most of these dead babies are born to poor mothers, and often mothers of color. But then the question becomes, why does the United States allow such deprivation to persist? The US is a rich country. Maybe the richest in the history of the world. So I guess the question kind of amounts to, why don't we behave like one? And the answer to this question is what has brought me here with you today, what brought me to write this book. The dead babies, in my understanding, are the product of America's racial conflict. They have died from this defining social feature. So let me step back for a moment. I arrived to American journalism not that long ago. It was the year 2000, and the Wall Street Journal hired me from a small Latin American magazine to write about the nation's Latinos, deploying me to Los Angeles to do that. These were heady times. The census was about to declare that Hispanics had breached the 35 million mark, and would soon become the largest minority group in the United States. Every company on the map was scrambling for a strategy to sell us stuff. And the Wall Street Journal, of course, was on it. Some of these efforts were kind of fun. Liz Claiborne tried to manufacture a Latino perfume to evoke the hips of Ricky Martin and J-Lo's décolletage. I remember a Puerto Rican sociologist at Fordham University I called to comment for this story, asking me, are we going to recognize each other when we wear this? Then there was the other story from the California Milk Board, which tried to sell milk to Hispanic teenagers by using the story of a Mexican ghost who killed all her children by drowning. But beyond this, the fun stuff, these fun stereotypes, my beat exposed me to a reality that was kind of darker. And it was a reality about the borders of race. It opened my eyes to kind of like the power that race, ethnicity has to organize American society. In LA at the time, you could almost smell the mistrust amongst ethnic lines, segregating neighborhoods between blacks and whites and Asians and Latinos. I mean, even the Latinos were by no means a cohesive entities. The Mexicans and the Salvadorians really did not get along. And then while I was there, came across a research by a couple of economists, Julian Betts and Robert Fairley at the University of California, Santa Cruz and San Diego. This paper that these guys wrote kind of provided an epiphany for me. They taught me how this hostility that I smelled on the street really shaped every American institution. It showed me just how deeply it stunted American society. So Fairley and Betts were testing, something more contained. How do American-born families in California react to the arrival of immigrant children from south of the border? They found that for every 4 immigrant kids going into a public high school in the United States, 1 American-born student was plucked out of the public school system and put into a private school instead. Now, you might call this small potatoes, and to be sure, this is really minor compared to the scorched earth violence that racism has shown us in other locales. This isn't about lynching or death. These are mothers taking their kids out of school to stop them from mingling with brown outsiders. Tame stuff. But nonetheless, this opened my eyes to the many ways in which divisions of race and ethnicity have shaped the American social contract. Just how deeply these thoughts over racial borders are kind of like rooted in our society. And critically and very specifically, it sort of like showed me how borders of race are weakening one of the central pillars of American society, which is the belief and the support for public goods. And that, at the end of the day, is the core of American Poison's argument. Americans decided that if public goods must be shared across lines of race and ethnicity, they would rather do without them. And we're living the consequences of that decision. So, by the way, Betts and Fairley's finding is just one strand in a pretty dense web of research. Some of the older findings include Jim Paterba of MIT that discovered in one research paper that the elderly are not particularly enthusiastic about spending on public education, spending on kids. What's interesting to me of their finding was that the enthusiasm drops particularly sharply if the school-age children in their neighborhood are from a different racial group than they are. Other studies find stuff pretty much along these lines. Diverse metropolitan areas have been found to invest less in things like garbage collection, parks and rec, cops, street maintenance than more homogeneous communities. White Protestant congregations have been found to become less generous at collection time when non-whites start filling the pews. And this all comes from the same place. Solidarity does not travel well across America's racial borders. And maybe William Julius Wilson, the eminent Harvard sociologist, put it best in his book, When Work Disappears. White taxpayers oppose welfare because they see themselves as being forced through taxes to pay for stuff for blacks that many of them could not afford for their own families. It is a uniquely American quandary. 3 economists, Alberto Alesina, Ed Glazer, and Bruce Sacerdote, looked at the difference between the American relatively threadbare social safety net and Europe's much more generous social democracies where welfare programs are much more richly endowed. And they concluded that one of the reasons for American stinginess in this regard was that America was a much more ethnically heterogeneous society compared to Europe. And the important thing to note in my mind is that the European safety nets, include many of the things that would keep more of the young babies of poor American mothers alive. And that takes me to the conclusion of my thought. If you want to understand why so many American babies die before they turn 1, a good place to look is the racial divisions that have determined how we've built our society and our safety net. This is old. I'm reminded of the long epistolary conversation between Friedrich Engels, the co-author of the Communist Manifesto, and his fellow traveler, Friedrich Adolf Sorge, an old friend. Sorge was also a German communist, but he fled into the United States in the second half of the 19th century and settled in Hoboken, New Jersey, trying to seed the class struggle from there. I'm going to turn the light on because I believe I might be going dark. I hope that's better, but just bear with me one more second. Okay, I think now I really do have the Klieg lights on me. So anyway, talking about Sorge and Engels, his friend. So Sorge came here to the United States to basically, bring the class struggle here, create a labor party, and try to move the United States in the direction that much of Western Europe was going, with strong labor movements. He organized the International Labor Union of Hoboken. He launched the New York Communist Club. He founded the United States First Socialist Party. But the most interesting feature to me of his experience is that he failed. Despite the social ferment and post-Civil War America, with its burgeoning industrial economy and its growing urban labor force, Sorge's attempts to fuel the flame of the class struggle pretty much went nowhere. And Engels, back in London, who kept a regular correspondent with Sorge, had a really interesting analysis of why Sorge was failing. He was failing, Engels thought, because of American diversity. Immigration, Engels wrote, would divide workers into two groups, the native-born and the foreigners. And the foreigners into Irish, Germans, Czechs, Poles, Italians, Scandinavians. Each group which would only understand itself. And on top of that, of course, Engels added was the ever-present dividing line between whites and blacks in this country. To form a single labor party out of all of these groups, he thought, would require enormously powerful incentives. The bourgeois need only wait passively, he wrote, and the dissimilar elements of the working class fall apart. Now, we may thank our ancestors for rejecting Sorge's invitation to the dictatorship of the proletariat. But the limits to solidarity identified in Engels' analysis also deprived America of the institutions that would have helped it better deal with the challenges it has faced as it has risen to become the richest economy in the world. The roadblocks to solidarity that Engels identified have stunted American progress for a very long time. And they make us into something that I think is less than a nation. Sorry. Look back through history. There are few greater heroes to American liberals than FDR, the first architect of the modern American welfare state. His New Deal deployed the power of the government to fight the devastation caused by the Great Depression, and it proposed the idea of government as kind of like the guarantor of the welfare of the governed. New Deal programs put millions of Americans back to work. On FDR's watch, workers gained the first national minimum wage, unemployment insurance, the right to form unions, strike, and engage in collective bargaining. The elderly got Social Security pensions. Still, that seminal period in the history of American progressivism was colored by the long stain of racial hostility. In order to win the support of Southern Democrats, Roosevelt ensured that major parts of the New Deal were beyond the reach of non-whites. The Federal Housing Authority is celebrated for expanding home ownership, offering federal guarantees to ensure mortgage loans for Americans of limited means. But it also contributed to the redlining of the country, refusing to back loans in predominantly Black neighborhoods, or for Black people, period. The Civilian Conservation Corps, which offered unskilled young men jobs in government lands, maintained camps segregated by race. The labor codes established by the National Recovery Administration allowed businesses to offer whites a first crack at jobs and authorize lower pay for Blacks. In their first incarnation, both Social Security and the Fair Labor Standards Act excluded both domestic and farm jobs, which just happened to employ 2 out of 3 Black workers. Now, I see this may offend, those believers in the grand alliance of working men and women, immigrants and racial minorities coming together to confront conservatives and their corporate allies. But that is what happened. Racism stymied the great liberal leap in American policymaking. Progressives clinging to Roosevelt's legacy failed to appreciate that New Deal country had really narrow borders designed to protect whites. And 3 decades later, when the movement for civil rights pierced through the racial wall, kind of like opening America's welfare state to Blacks and other minorities, the political consensus that had set America down the path to social democracy collapsed entirely. Kind of like shocked by the diversity on their streets, the white majority turned away from the ethos of FDR's New Deal, which proposed a society wrapped up together in a common safety net. If the safety net had to be shared with people of color, whites decided they would rather not have one. Medicare and Medicaid are the last government programs that were inspired by the New Deal ethos. They were signed into law in 1965, 1 short year after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And right then, America pivoted. That same year, Lyndon Johnson presented Americans with a war on crime. And a few years later, Richard Nixon offered that war as a new lodestar for American social policy. Over the next half century, prison became America's favored tool of social management. And unlike Social Security or unemployment insurance, prison was targeted squarely at Blacks. I'm not, by the way, dismissing America's sometimes amazing achievements. And I'm not arguing against the American dream. I actually witnessed the American dream. It looked pretty much like my grandparents' house in Phoenix. They had a house that wasn't big. It was 2 bedrooms, 1 bath. It had a date tree in the yard out front, a driveway with an awning in the back. It was, to be sure, on the wrong side of the tracks, south and west from the money in Scottsdale, but it was relentlessly air-conditioned, with this kind of plush green carpeting from wall to wall, complicated sound system. There was a huge TV in the den and an 8-track. There was a double-wide fridge. There was a pickup truck and a Pontiac in the back. There was prosperity. Now, my grandparents were nowhere near rich. They were the kind of iconic white working class Americans that Norman Rockwell loved to paint. not super well educated, honest by and large, hardworking. They had lived through the Great Depression in Chicago and moved southwest, where my grandfather got a job on the Salt River Project as an electrician, and my grandmother worked as a librarian. Retired on Social Security, they lived a frugal but hardly uncomfortable life. I didn't see them often. My parents moved to Mexico when I was 6 to be near my mother's family, but I visited summers throughout my childhood. They would pack me off to Sunday school, where I learned that the European community somehow presaged the coming of the Antichrist. We would go then ice skating in the mall, and eventually we would just leave the sweltering heat of Phoenix to go and spend some really nice lazy months up in Sedona on the banks of the old creek in Red Rock country. Tucked in at night, in the bed that kind of doubled up as a dining room table in my grandparents' trailer, parked at the Hawkeye Trailer Park. I couldn't but marvel at what seemed like a pretty cool existence, From my perspective, growing up amid Mexico's privileged but surrounded by a sea of poverty, my grandparents' American world, with the air-conditioned house and the sound system and the Pontiac, kind of amounted to a fundamentally superior place. In Mexico, where I was growing up, retired electricians did not get this life. The American middle class was, indeed, exceptional. Problem is that in the many years since those summers back in Sedona, I've kind of come to understand the limitations of the dream. From my new vantage point, grumpy old writer in New York, I can tell you that this exemplary America was always a little bit of a fiction. For starters, that dream was always too narrow. It only welcomed Americans of white, non-Hispanic stock. But what's more, it also turned out to be immensely fragile. There's little today to remind me of my grandparents' emerging exemplary working class life. Their home was demolished years ago to make way for the Red Mountain Freeway. The neighborhood they lived in has a harsher edge. More than half the children in their old zip code live in poverty. A third live with a single parent. Phoenix has mushroomed. Its population has almost tripled since 1970. But a typical household in the city makes some 15% less after inflation than it did a quarter of a century ago. The working class, more Latino than it was back then, cannot afford my grandparents' life. And so it is across the country. My grandparents' dream does not fit in contemporary America. Today, 16 million people live below 1/2 of the poverty line, 6 million more than half a century ago. They are living on $8.50 a day or less. And that's even after including government assistance. In today's America, the death rate from drug overdoses is about as high as the death rate from AIDS was at its peak in the mid-1990s. And whether it is the incidence of diabetes and obesity, the death rate from parasites and other infections, years lost of premature death, or those babies I was talking about, today's America is considerably less healthy than any other rich country in the world. And it's not just about health. The US also suffers the highest teen pregnancy rate in the developed world, about 7 times the rate in France. More than 1 out of every 4 children live with only one parent, the largest percentage by far among industrialized nations. And more than 1/5 of American kids live in poverty, putting the US 6th from the bottom among the 34 countries in the OECD. Now, we like to blame globalization and technological change for these misfortunes, But globalization and tech happened to everyone. The French and the Germans and the Canadians and the Japanese. But American society, its hospitals and its schools, its roads and its middle-class homes, buckled all alone. How come? The United States simply showed no interest in building the kind of safeguards erected in other countries to protect those on the wrong side of the wrenching changes that globalization and tech brought about. So when the good jobs wither and the wages got stuck, the American safety net could not hold the line. Americans' dead babies and its bloated prisons, its idle men and its single moms can all be traced to this exceptional fact. Americans chose to leave those sinking to sink. And why did we do that? Because many of the sinking people were people of color. Why would white Americans help them? The dark irony of this fact is that the inability to extend empathy across lines of race shaped a society that betrayed white Americans too. Much of white America, the part addled by opioids, ravaged by suicide, despairing of a future, is also a victim of a nation that refuses to care. Now, you'll ask, can we shake racism out of the social contract? I mean, the answer has got to be yes. I remember back in the days that I was working for the Wall Street Journal in LA, reading about how demographic change would eventually convert the United States into a social democracy. And the argument kind of made sense. You know, once young minorities, which are generally more supportive of government assistance, outvoted older whites who are opposed to having their taxes deployed to help people of color, you know, maybe we could get somewhere closer to a true welfare state. By the early 2040s, in fact, non-whites, by the census definition, will be a majority of Americans. And so, you know, maybe the more fluid racial identities that Latin Americans and other immigrants bring with them into the US might soften America's clear-cut racial barriers, might enlarge kind of the understanding of what it means to be a mainstream American, you know, pushing against this urge to define a country as split between us and the other. It makes sense. I mean, take Hispanics like me. We are, for starters, an American confection, you know, invented by the White House Office of Management and Budget. Outside of the US, we don't exist. In the parts of the world where we come from, people call themselves Mexican or Ecuadorian or Guatemalan or something like that. We may share Spanish, you know, Christianity, a common history of rule from Spain, but we only turn into Hispanics when we enter the United States, whether by plane or after a 3-day trek through the Arizona desert. We're not very familiar with America's racial boxes either. You know, in much of Latin America, most people identify as mixed, in fact. Almost half of Brazilians call themselves pardos, or brownish. Mexico is officially a mestizo country. The last time the Mexican census asked about race was in 1921. This isn't to say, though, that racism does not exist in Latin America. It is prevalent there. Brazil has a history of slavery more brutal even than America's. Its new president, Jair Bolsonaro, is even suggesting that Afro-Brazilians should not procreate. It gets kind of crazy. And in Mexico, kind of like this state-sanctioned mestizo identity thing has also been used to define kind of its indigenous populations out of existence. Right? I can remember back in the 1990s when the Zapatista guerrillas emerged from the jungle in Chiapas. People were thinking, who are these guys, indigenous Tzeltales and Tzotziles, coming out of the jungle? Indigenous groups subsisting on the margins of society. They weren't supposed to be what Mexico was. But nonetheless, despite this clear racial bias that exists throughout Latin America too, nowhere in Latin America, and in fact, I would posit that nowhere or in many few places in the world, is race as omnipresent and omnipotent as it is in the United States. I'm a mongrel. I'm the son of a tall, fair Anglo dad from Chicago and a darker Mexican mother who stands just, over 5 feet tall and draws from a mix of European and indigenous American blood. As a colleague at the New York Times once told me, I read white. And when I'm out on the street in Mexico, Mexicans often call me güero, which translates loosely as blondie. Growing up in Mexico City, where the correlation between skin color and privilege must be at least as strong as it is in the US, I led a privileged existence. But until I moved back here, I had never quite experienced the kind of organizing power that race has in the United States. Well into the modern era, race has determined where you could live, whether you could get a loan, how you could serve in the military, whether you could get a federal government job. Racial boundaries are written into policies, laws, and contracts still today. The very fight against racial discrimination, which is a seminal moment in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, reiterated race as America's most relevant social marker. Race upheld its place as a variable around which to organize society. Measuring race remains to this day a critical tool of governance. The question is, can we, the hyphenated Americans that are going to make the majority of the population in the future, change that? Despite what I've just said, our different understanding of racial identity, I'm not confident, frankly. Because for all I can tell, we are moving as a country in exactly the opposite direction. Rather than progressing toward a more inclusive definition of the mainstream, white Americans are retreating into their box. And they are dictating the policies of the day. Think back to the spring of 2015. That's roughly when I started thinking about this book. I did not imagine at the time that immigration had the power to put somebody into the White House. Only 4% of Americans thought that immigration was the nation's most critical challenge. About 3/4 thought it was a good thing, good for the country. Only about 1/3 of Americans, according to polls, thought that we should have less of it. And the objective facts seem to be quite tame. Illegal immigration seemed contained. The number of unauthorized immigrants in the United States had been declining pretty steadily since 2007, on the eve of the Great Recession. The economy was doing okay. Unemployment was falling. But then Donald Trump joined the presidential race, promising to stop the hordes of rapist thugs that he claimed were streaming into the United States illegally from Mexico. He pledged to build a wall to lock down America's sieve-like southern border. And suddenly, kind of a fear of swarthy invaders rose from the depths of American subconscious and took the electorate over. It propelled Donald Trump to the presidency, and it probably changed the United States for good. There's a public park near where my son, Mateo, used to go to school. It's not far from here. It's named in a Brooklyn sort of way, after a Beastie Boy, Adam Yauch. In the days after the election, somebody drew a swastika on the playground equipment, alongside the exhortation, "Go Trump." I grew up mostly in Mexico. I consider myself both Mexican and American. At home, I speak mostly Spanish, hoping that Mateo will embrace his Mexican side too. The day after the election, we were riding the subway when he kind of leaned into me and whispered, "Hey, Dad, perhaps we shouldn't speak Spanish in public anymore." Now, one might read this moment in American history as an aberration, brought about by some uniquely xenophobic and racist political entrepreneur. Alternatively, one might explain this as the product of a specific set of economic circumstances, working class voters frustrated by decades of wage stagnation, lashing out against the cosmopolitan elites that ignored their plights for so long. Now, and these factors, I acknowledge, probably played a role, but it would be a really big mistake to give a pass to the deep vein of racial hostility that is still, after all these years, with us, and that, to my mind, have shaped our political future. Mr. Trump's appeal to 63 million voters was anchored, most crucially, in a mix of contempt and fear for the Black and the brown. So minorities might help reshape American politics in a more inclusive direction one day. But between now and then, the more important political force seems to be that of these freaked out white voters giving their all to delay their fall from power. Racial hostility is not going away. It is reshaping Americans' political geography. Half a century after the Republican Party leveraged whites' revolt against the civil rights legislation to seize control of the South, Donald Trump deployed racial animosity to exploit the fault line, dividing a white small-town America from its large, diverse cities. So in 2016, Hillary took the large, diverse metros, but non-metropolitan areas turned out for Trump by margins exceeding 40% on average. And the voters in these small white towns that overwhelmingly voted for President Trump probably do not see many people of color in their daily lives. They see them coming, though, and they are battening down the hatches. So, I haven't been a victim of America's racial violence. I've never been frisked by a cop or lost a job because of my skin or my accent. My Latino identity might even have helped me get jobs at the Journal or the Times. They likely saw me as, a desirable minority to count towards their diversity goals and maybe dilute their image as bastions of whiteness. I have not been directly punished by my race, but I nonetheless mourn the society that racism stopped us from building. So I'm about to end and to open this up for you guys to ask questions. But before I kind of realized that maybe I should apologize for being so short on optimism. In the end, however, I do believe that America's racial poison cannot be insurmountable. I mean, we did pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act. We did at one point push hard to desegregate schools. And it is in fact true that younger generations of Americans seem more comfortable in this rich, multiracial environment than their parents and grandparents. But the challenge is great and can't be glossed over. The challenge is about how to build a public discourse around America's multiplicity of people, to build solidarity across lines of identity. And I don't see anybody making that argument. But the point is that America may not be a melting pot. It is not. But it could one day maybe become one. So anyway, I've gone on for too long. Thank you so much. If anybody wants to chime in, ask a question, say something, please do. I just click on a little button on the bottom and I get to see it. Okay, so there is one question here from Territorial. How will the current crisis exacerbate systemic inequalities? Is there anything we can do to combat this? I mean, this is a good question, and I don't have a really well prepared answer, but I have a couple of ideas. One of them comes from a book I once read by an economist at Stanford called Walter Scheidel. He wrote a book called The Great Leveling. In that book, he kind of like tracks back kind of like through the Stone Age and the moments in which the United States and the world have managed to push back in any important way against rising income inequality. And his conclusion is that we only have been able to do that in the face of great calamity, be it a pandemic or be it a massive war or some big massacre. Those are the moments in which societies have changed course and kind of like stopped the maldistribution of prosperity into the hands of the very few. So if that is indeed true, this kind of like a global crisis might open space for some more collective thinking, more empathetic thinking. But at the same time, I don't really want to be naive. I think that America's relatively poor response to this current pandemic has a lot to do with the poor state of our safety net. And so I think that, and I don't see in the policies that I've seen proposed to date, I can still see the influence of the arguments that have kept our safety net so poor. Arguments that, helping poor people is helping moochers, that we cannot discourage employment, that, we, hard-earned taxpayers' money should not be deployed to serve somehow the less deserving. I still think that is a very, very strong strand in our thinking. And I'm not sure that even something as big as this epidemic will manage to overcome. There is a really nice book, a really nice question from Beth about, she is asking who I hope this book to reach. And I've thought about that, and I have kind of two thoughts that are a little bit in tension with each other. On one hand, I really hope that this book is read in, what I'll call white America. I want white Americans to read this and not to feel kind of like cornered by my arguments. Because I think that it is important to understand that this country that we've developed that has been, kind of like so constrained by lines of race has hurt not just people of color, but it has hurt everybody. It has hurt the very construct as a nation. And so I would be very happy if white Americans could kind of like take something away from that argument, and to build on that. I hope that when I'm speaking of racial divisions and racial hostility and sometimes bigotry, I hope that I've conveyed it in all its complexity, because this discussion easily gets narrowed down by words into, down to the word racism, and racism is about bigots, and it's about, evil and harm inflicted upon people of color. But I think that what I'm talking about, it includes that, but it is a broader term that also talks about all the kind of barriers that we set between us and the other. It's not just about hating people of another ethnicity or another race. It is about tribalism, these kind of like shutting down, circling the wagons around our own, and just confining our empathy to our in-group. This is something that is not just that is not just a feature of white America. It's a feature of all sorts of ethnic and cultural groups. You see this everywhere in the world. And so I want to increase the understanding of racial barriers, to incorporate this broader understanding of what they mean, and to understand the damage that they can do to a society that really must rely upon solidarity, upon empathy, to build kind of the institutions that help everyone. Right? Now, but there's also another group that I want to talk to that I feel that I might have trouble reaching with this book, which is, the African Americans in the United States. I've had this sense at times that I will not be considered a legitimate voice in this conversation, because I am not Black, I am Latino, and my history and the history of my forebears is not kind of like suffused with this really scorched earth violence with which African communities were scorched with, that victimized African Americans. And that hence I really can't talk about this stuff, because I don't really know in the flesh. And what I'd like to say about that is that's true. I don't really know this in the flesh. But I think at the same time that this is an argument that is, again, broader than that one painful and frankly indelible wound in this country's history. And that I think that that the conversation about the costs to society and the cost to our future has to invite others in. And so I think that I think that I do have something valuable to say, but I would really, really like African Americans to kind of like be open to some of these arguments, and get pissed off with me and argue with me and so forth, but not to just shut it down. And let me go through now. There's some, you guys, you can vote on questions. So if you see somebody asks a question that you like, and you can vote on it, and the more you vote on it, the higher it'll show up, and so the easier all up. So Daryl asks about reparations, and I do talk a little bit about that. And my argument is that the the argument from justice that we can solve our racial conflict from justice is kind of wrong, in the sense that it doesn't really take us to the place that I think that we need to be as a country. So let me just try to flesh that out a little bit more. I mean, put it super starkly. Let's kind of like the argument that white Americans owe African Americans a certain amount of money, or because of because of the slavery and all the other kind of punishments that whites over American history imposed upon Black communities, might be, and in fact I think is in many instances correct. I mean, the fact that these injustices happened is absolutely true, and the idea that they should be compensated in some ways seems to me reasonable. But in the political context of the United States today, I think this idea leads us away from where I think that we need to go, which is in towards more cohesion rather than less cohesion. I think the argument for reparations, as other arguments from justice, that say you guys have to pay me for the bad things that you guys did as a collective, will actually poison our politics, will lead us to, a double down on the kind of politics that we've seen from the current administration. Politics that propose whites as in fact victims that are being abused by these arguments from minorities, and will create a much more divided country. So at the end of the day, I think that arguments for reparations are not the way to go. I think they divide us more, and I think that is something that we really want to avoid. So do I think fear of the other? This is from Ferenc. Do I think fear of the other is inherently human? Yes, I do. I do think it's inherently human. It's as old as the hills. In fact, it's pre-human. There are studies from biology of that show how in-group, out-group dynamics work, and how those can be help survival of different groups. So yes, this is very old. But I also think that it behooves us as modern people trying to form complex societies with enormous amounts of technology and spectacular wealth to set up the systems that push against these things. I cannot believe that is impossible. And yes, so it's true, there are not only lines of race that are dividing people in the world, but lines of religion and lines of language and lines of nationality, or even fluffier things like culture. These things always have set up us and them kind of dynamics that kind of short circuit the development of more inclusive polities, for sure. But I also think that it must be our goal to work for a more inclusive understanding of who we are. And in the United States, which is, I think, one of the most diverse countries in the world today, with the greatest variety of others inside it, no matter who you are, whether you're white or Black or Christian or Muslim or, you name it, probably the majority of people in this country are not like you. It behooves this. I mean, the United States really. This is a particularly urgent task for a country like ours. Do I think Europe has helped itself by opening its borders to immigrants? I don't know that that's in fact true. To some extent, it has. I mean, with the big wave of refugees from Syria and Iraq did lead to a response by some countries in the European Union to increase the number of refugees that it accepted. But that was hardly universal. Some countries were putting up barbed wire around their borders while this was happening. And I think compared to the United States, the European Union has been historically less permeable, as it were, to immigrants from poorer parts of the world. So I happen to think that Europe is going to have to change its policies and become more inviting to immigrants because immigrants are going to arrive. Europe is surrounded by parts of the world that are much poorer and in much greater stress than Europe is. And I think those stresses are only going to increase. Climate change is going to vastly increase the, say, incentive to emigrate from sub-Saharan Africa. And the place that people in sub-Saharan Africa emigrate to tends to be Western Europe. So to my mind, just facing that fact, it would make sense for Europe to think not about how much barbed wire to put around their borders, but how how their societies can adapt better to what I see as a kind of inevitable demographic shift. So here's a question about Latin America. And oops, I just lost it. Oh yeah. Here it is, about how Latin communities in the United States are marginalized. Voting levels are lower than in other communities, badly served by the US media. Trump has galvanized the Latino pushback, but it's still tentative. Do I see signs of American Latinos starting to raise their voice and profile as their demographic numbers increase? Yeah, I mean, I think that's been true for a couple of decades now, but it's also been very slow. Latino voting power has gradually increased, especially in the West, in the Southwest of the country. And you've got places like California where the Latino vote is pretty determinant of a lot of political futures. And I think that shifts to the Democratic Party in places like Nevada and New Mexico and even Arizona are driven by the increasing Latino population. Now, it's, to be sure, very slow because voting rates in the Latino community are extremely low. And the reasons for that are various. I mean, many Latinos in the United States are not citizens, and so the voting rates in the community will remain low. But I also think that the kind of voter suppression techniques that have been deployed against people of color, mainly thinking about Blacks, have also been deployed against Latinos. And so I do expect this progress to be slow, but I expect it to be steady. There's some states in this country where you cannot win without Latino support. And I do think, I mean, if you look at voting in the primaries, I do expect that they will make their voices heard more than they have in the past. Will Latino political power equal their demographic clout? Not anytime soon. Again, because I think in particular because the fact that so many of them are not citizens. But I at least I think the arrow is moving in the right direction. And I think we're kind of like going overboard a little bit now. I'm not sure how long this was supposed to last, but let me answer. I hope you haven't gotten bored yet. Let me answer this last question about education and busing and integrating neighborhoods. I mean, I think that this is actually the place that offers the most hope. This is the where I think the rubber hits the road if we're thinking of what sort of initiatives and policies could help us create this more inclusive sense of America. It's in neighborhoods, and it's in schools, and it's in workplaces. It's in getting people to kind of like share the same spaces, go to the same shops, see each other on a daily basis, and see each other as, equal human beings. I know that sounds super corny, but I think that is really the first place that we can go to. And there are, in fact, I think, interesting experiments along those lines. There's a community not far from here in New Jersey called Mount Laurel, where there was this kind of like African American community that was at risk of being like essentially pushed out by a development that for basically rich white folks, and they fought back, and they fought back hard, and it took them years and years and years, but they ultimately won, and they got the New Jersey legislature to pass some legislation that ensured that when some of these kind of like new developments for rich people were created, they had to include some sort of like affordable housing that in a proportion that sort of matched the underlying population of the place. And this is now like kind of like spread throughout New Jersey, and the idea has kind of like spread through other states. But in this particular part of New Jersey, there's this, in Mount Laurel, there's this place called the Ethel Lawrence Homes, that named after the person, Ethel Lawrence, who started this 5 years ago. She's dead now, unfortunately. Where kind of like amid this sea of white prosperity, there are these kind of like working class homes, which are really kind of nice. And it's kind of like, it seems to me, an experiment in the sort of inclusionary politics that I think could help to build cohesion and bring people together, and also kind of prevent this kind of like increasing social separation by race, of increasing by also becoming, because social separation by race also gets entwined in social separation by income. And so you start seeing these two things operating in tandem and creating an increasingly segregated country. I think that these sorts of policies that are aimed at pushing back, at mitigating this segregation, whether it be in neighborhoods or in schools or in workplaces, I think that is as policymakers, I think that would be the first place I would try the intervention that I think offers greatest hope. So, I'm gonna close it now. I mean, I'm looking at a screen that shows my face. I can't see you guys. So it's kind of weird saying, okay, guys, bye, have a good time, have a glass of wine and some crackers, because I guess you each have your own wine and crackers at home. I'm not talking to a gathering. But I really just want to say that I so appreciate your being here. I'm really happy that you are kind of interested in the book. And I would really love it if you were to buy it and read it, and then, write at me and say something about what you thought about it, whether it's, whether you agree or are pissed off by my arguments. But again, thanks a lot. I hope I get to do more of these. Maybe I'll be a little bit better at them the next time around. But you guys, take care.
Hi, everyone. We just want to thank our author, Eduardo Porter, for that talk. I think this is such an interesting and really crucial topic. So be sure to click the green button below to buy his book, Straight from Politics and Prose. Again, you get free shipping through March 31st. And we hope you'll join us for some of our other live streamed events. For example, tomorrow at 8 p.m., we have our first ticketed event with N.K. Jemisin for her book, The City We Became. Tickets are $10, but if you buy the book from Politics and Prose, you will get an access code that lets you into the event for free. Right before Jemisin's event is Gerald Posner for Pharma. That will be happening at 6 p.m. That's a really timely talk. And then coming up, we have events with Emily St. John Mandel and Jen Gotch, David Kessler. We have lots of stuff coming, so be sure to check the Politics and Prose calendar online at politics-prose.com. And again, we just thank you so much for your support and for being here. So everyone have a great night and stay well read.